And then I hope we can maybe have a discussion, have some questions, kind of think about it. But I really want to talk about what it is to live as an Orthodox Christian, put it into practice, not just have this abstract faith in our minds, but something that really takes root in our hearts. And I think that's something that's really difficult. It's something that a lot of Christian traditions have been struggling with recently. I'm sure we all hear this. I don't know the numbers in Australia. In the United States, when we've measured it, at least 60% of young people who grow up in their particular faith tradition will fall away as they become young adults, right? If anything, actually, it's become worse. I mean, in my own life, it's about 90%. 90% of the kids that I grew up with in Sunday school and playing basketball at the parish and, Greek dancing, all that stuff, 90% of them not connected with the church anymore. So it's tough, right? It's tough to be a Christian. It's tough to stay a Christian. And I wonder if that's maybe because of the way that we sometimes introduce or fail to introduce young people in particular into the tradition of the church. I'll think about it this way, maybe a metaphor for us to think about. Can you see the mountain now? Did the slide change? Okay. So mountains are a pretty common symbol that we see in the scripture, right? Mountains, we see like Moses climbed up the mountain to get the 10 commandments, right? Elijah heard the still small voice of God on a mountain. Christ is transfigured upon a mountain. These are symbolically places where we go to ascend to meet God, right? We see this especially on the Transfiguration, where Christ ascends this mountain, his disciples are with him. And of course, Christ is always the Son of God. He's always radiating this light, but something happens to the disciples on the mountain of Transfiguration that changes them and gives them the eyes to see the Lord for who he really is, right? It's this place of ascent. It's this place of encounter. It's this place of transformation, these mountains. But I want to give you another image of mountains, the mountain of stuff that we place in the way of young people. The mountain of books that we have young people read during Sunday school, the mountain of lessons and lectures that we give to them, right? We give young people this mountain of stuff from the time they're 3 or 4 or 5 years old, depending on the parish, up until they're 18. And yet, at the end of that life cycle, when somebody becomes 18 years old, 19 years old, how many of the young people who pass through the church come down this mountain, not having encountered God, not having ascended to the throne of Christ, not having been transfigured, not faithful Christians, but former Christians? That, I think, becomes our challenge. What exactly is going on with that? And there's a story that I want to tell you of a young woman that I met at a retreat many years ago. Her life really kind of encapsulates this very well. And I want to offer her story as a maybe test case to think about what is it to actually learn to live as an Orthodox Christian? What is it to learn to put faith into practice? So I was doing a retreat in the New York area a few years ago, and I was doing a young adult conversation. We were sitting in the parish, getting to know people, and this young woman walked in. Don't worry, not her actual face. It's just a stock photo. Names are changed to protect the innocent. But her name was Catherine. Catherine came in and she sat with us. And as we're going around telling our stories, she told us her story. And Catherine told us that she grew up in the parish. She grew up in this community in the New York area. And when she was a kid, she was super involved with everything that the parish did. She was at Sunday school. She was at Greek dance. She was at basketball. She was at volleyball. She was at the festival volunteering. She was at the church 3, 4, 5 days a week. And of course, Sunday morning during liturgy, right? If we think of a success story of ministry, a young woman like Catherine would be that kind of success story. Anything that we're giving her, she's picking up. She's coming to everything. She's active in everything. And yet, when she graduated high school, she fell off the face of the planet. And the way that she describes it is really interesting. She described it to us not as a process, not that she began losing her faith or anything like that, but that she was in and then she was out, like that, like a light switch went off, like she fell off of a waterfall. And it's interesting to me. She comes back finally all these years later. She says she's been looking for some group to belong to. She heard that a group of young adults were gathering and she wanted to connect with this group. And it was interesting, the language that she used, right? Because here is this young woman who spent 13, 14, 15 years in such close proximity with the life of the church, right? Every youth ministry event that we were giving her, she was participating in. And then she leaves. And when she comes back, she doesn't tell us that she's looking for Christ. She doesn't tell us that she's looking to deepen her faith. She doesn't tell us that she wants to belong to the church. She tells us that she wants to get to know people, that she wants to belong to a group. And I wonder if the problem is we gave her a group all those years. We never gave her faith. We gave her ideas, but we never gave her a lived sense of what it is to be a Christian. Because we gave her a lot, right? She walked up this mountain. From the time she was 3 or 4 or 5, she was at church, like I said, 3, 4, 5 days a week consistently. And at the end of all of that, she leaves and she becomes not a faithful Christian, but a former Christian. You might have heard this in the business world. We often talk about starting with why, that we have to sort of have a clear sense of who we are and where we're going and why we are what we are. And I think that why, which businesses are really good at capturing, which consumer campaigns and commercials are really good at communicating, that why is something that we sometimes struggle with as Orthodox Christians. You know, like me, like Catherine, people who get a lot of data about the church, who get a lot of lectures and a lot of lessons and a lot of abstract ideas, right? Kind of like points on a page, things in a book, ideas, but no real sense of the true why, which is Christ himself. And so when I think as we, as Orthodox Christians who are now not kids, right? We are here as adults who are in some cases parents, in some cases teachers, in some cases future parents, right? People who not only have some level of control over our own spiritual lives, but some level of leadership and responsibility over the lives of the next generation. It's important for us to think about, what is that why? How do we capture that why? How do we make sure that when a young person like Catherine spends 15 years in the church, it's for the betterment of her faith. It's for her closeness with Christ, right? That she's ascending this mountain and is transfigured at the top, not as bored at the top and comes down a former Christian. So I want to give you kind of a very simple mindset or a very simple kind of framework to think about this, because I think this is something that motivates all of the work that we do here at the Archdiocese in the United States. We've tried to clarify and list as kind of simply as we can the core needs that we all have in our lives. And we put them in a particular order because I think if people are going to learn how to be Christians, it's about meeting these needs. It's about helping them to meet these needs in a lived, practical sort of way. So we're not just throwing ideas at young people, but we're actually bringing them in, initiating them into the life of the church. And here are these 5 needs that I think are universal for all of us. One, all of us, not just young people, all of us need to know Jesus Christ first and foremost. He, if anything else, is our supreme why, right? Revelation tells us that he is the Alpha and the Omega. And there are so many young people who walk through the church and don't actually have a sense of knowing him. And notice there's a difference between knowing about Jesus and knowing Jesus, right? Think about somebody who's very close to you. Think about a spouse. Think about a really good friend, right? It is one thing to say, my best friend is 5 foot something tall and has brown hair and has brown eyes, right? I can list all sorts of things about a person, but that doesn't mean I actually know a person, right? And I think the experience that we have sometimes as Orthodox Christians is knowing a lot about Jesus, but not actually knowing him, not actually having a relationship with him, not actually having an experience of him. And that leads into the second need, to know who we truly are.
Stephen, I'm so sorry, I'm going to interrupt. I just want to check we're on the right slides. We're still up to the 5 practices slide.
5 needs?
We can't see 5 needs, unfortunately.
It's been changing. Sorry, Stephen. So we're up to the very beginning, 5 practices slide with the mountain at the bottom.
Oh, has it not moved at all the entire time?
No, sorry.
Oh, weird. Hold on. Maybe wait.
Now we can see them moving.
There we go. The 5.
Oh,
That's it. Thank you. Sorry to interrupt you.
no, sorry. I was like, I thought this was moving and it wasn't. I apologize. Okay. I've had all these like fancy pictures on here and you haven't seen anything. Oh my goodness.
Sorry. Thank you. We'll see them now. Thank you.
I have egg on my face. No, thank you. So here are the 5 needs. So we can actually see them while we talk about them. The 5 needs. First, to actually know Jesus Christ, right? The second, to know who we truly are. And we can only understand that if we first know who Jesus is, because we know ourselves in connection and in relation to him. You know, think about what it is to grow up. Think about the different phases that you had growing up. Music phases, style phases, right? I mean, I go back and I look at the photos of me as like a teen and I want to burn them all because they're embarrassing, because it's like, oh, my hair was weird at this point. And that's just like the life cycle, right? My parents would look back at themselves in the 70s with their big collars and everything, and they laughed at that. And now I laugh at myself. And, that's just, it's the life cycle. We spend a lot of effort literally trying on different clothes, trying on different styles, trying to figure out who we are until something fits. The church gives us this identity. The church gives us the white garment of baptism. The church tells us that who you are is in your relationship with Christ, that you are this person who gets to put on Christ in baptism, that you are this person who is, yes, a sinner, somebody who has work to do in his or her life, but somebody who is loved and forgiven. That's who you are. You are invited to be a child of God. Who cares what music you listen to? Who cares what grades you get? Who cares all the different sort of social stresses, right? Like figuring out who we are is probably just such an exhausting thing. And it is a gift that is given to us. We don't really have to figure it out. We are children of God. We are beloved by the one who made us and the one who made all things. And what a gift that is. But we won't know that if we don't know who he is. As we know him, then we come to know who we are. And there's grace in that, and there's comfort in that, and there's belonging in that. And that takes us to the third need. To belong, we need to belong to the full community of the church. This is something that, especially with young people, we're not that great at, because what do? We take young people in many, many traditions, we take them out of liturgy when we do Sunday school with them or other kinds of programs with them. We take young people and we do what schools do. We group them according to their grade level. So the 7-year-olds spend all their time with the 7-year-olds and the 8-year-olds spend all their time with the 8-year-olds, but that's not how the world works. Like this is why I think that that experience can be so jarring, because you graduate high school, right? And every year of your life, like when you're 16, you're with the 16-year-olds. And when you're 17, you're with the 17-year-olds. And then suddenly in college for the first time, you realize that, oh, different aged people do things together. And then you work. And then you realize that, oh, I don't only work with the people who are 23 or 24. I work in the same company with people who are in their 70s and 80s. And because life is this bigger thing than just my narrow demographic slice. Yet that's sometimes the way that we push young people off into this little box, the way that schools do. And it undermines the ability for them to see themselves as part of this full community of the church. Young Christians in particular often see themselves as junior Christians or practice Christians, but no, they receive the same Eucharist that we do, right? They've become members of the church, no less than any of us. And we have to make them understand that they belong to the full community of the church. That means connection. That means not isolation. That means bringing them into something more than just kind of this narrow slice that we often have for them. And that leads us to the fourth need, to be empowered with a faith that makes a difference. This is where we begin to hit some of these sticking points, because young people like Catherine, they grow up in the church, and I think they ask themselves, like, what's the point? What's the point of any of this? All of these wonderful lessons that I hear, like, what's the point of any of this? It's our job to help people realize that the things that we believe are not simply meant to be preached, they're meant to be practiced. If we're really going to love our neighbor, then we have to love our neighbor. I mean, look at what the church has been throughout history. This is, I think, a wonderful example of church history. When the church really first began to grow, it was for two key reasons. It was the blood of the martyrs, as we say in our prayers. It was the witness of these people who were willing to lay everything on the line, because again, it mattered. And the fact that they were willing to lay their lives for Christ showed that it mattered. And it was because Christians were the ones who were actually taking care of the poor and the downtrodden in a way that didn't happen in the larger Christian world, or in the larger Roman world. There are these really wonderful stories that you'll see of plagues back in the day. All of the rich Romans would leave the cities, go to their villas, and people would die because nobody would take care of them. And yet Christians stuck around. Christians offered food and water to these people who were dying of fevers. And when they came to and they were healed, they looked out of their bed and they saw the faces of Christians smiling down at them. And they were loved into the church because they realized it matters. When Christ talks to us about judgment in Matthew 25, he doesn't say that there's an entrance examination, that we have to know this or that kind of dogma. He says, I was hungry and you gave me food. I was thirsty and you gave me drink. And yet young people, I think, don't see that in the church. I'll give you a really tragic example of this. There's a young man that we interviewed recently. We have a podcast where we interview young adults. As he got older, he realized that there was a lot of poverty in his community. And he reached out to his parish and he said, is there something that we can do? We're Christians. There's young people in our larger neighborhood who are not graduating high school, who have difficulty going to college. Like, what can we do for them? And the response that he got was, well, we're kind of busy figuring out our food festival. We're not really interested. And that was a defining moment in the life of this young man. He dedicated his life to working in nonprofits, to working in inner city schools, helping these kids. He doesn't identify as an Orthodox Christian anymore. And what a shame that when it came down to it, that's the moment of separation. He saw a need. He realized that the gospel calls us to do something about this need. He brought that need to his community and they said, not interested. They showed him that the faith doesn't make a difference in the world. And so he left. Young people need to realize that the faith does make a difference, that this matters. The things that we talk about matter. They change our lives. They change our pocketbooks. They change the way that we interact with each other. We are supposed to be known by our love, by our joy, by the things we actually do in the world. And then, finally, number 5, we get to young people need to be equipped with the teachings of the church. I think sometimes we lead with this, right? We lead with this. When somebody is interested in the church, right? You have a friend who maybe heard about Orthodoxy for the first time. What do we do usually? The first thing that we do normally is we give them a book, right? We give them a book because it's just philosophy in our minds. It's just sort of a collection of like words on a page. How often do we invite people into our homes to pray with them, to teach them to pray? How often do we invite them to church? It's funny, like 95% of the time that I can think of interactions that I've had or friends of mine have had, like, oh, you're interested, here's the stack of books that you should read, which is exactly the way that we proclaim Socrates and Plato and Aristotle to people. But Christ is not just a philosopher, right? Christ is the Alpha and the Omega. And I think the way that we do things, when we invert these needs and we start with the teachings, we miss that why. We miss that why. Instead of beginning by giving people an experience of Christ, then teaching them about who they are in connection with the Lord, then teaching them that they belong to the fullness of his body, to the fullness of the church, that their belonging matters because they are called to do and be something in the world. And then we can get into some of those dogmas and some of those teachings, because then we know why they matter. You think about some of the things that we say about Christ. We call him the philanthropos, for example, the lover of mankind. That word is meaningless until we have seen his love, right? Otherwise, what does it mean? What does it mean to say that he is the lover of mankind? I have seen the way that he loves us. I have seen the way that he's healed the sick, that he gave sight to the blind. I saw the way that he died on the cross for me. I get it. Yes, he loves mankind, right? Good ministry precedes good theology. An experience of the Lord comes first. Then we put words on it to understand our experience. That teaching comes last. But then, of course, it's this cycle, because the more that we learn about Christ, the more that we can deepen our love for him that way. And that leads us back to need number 1 and need number 2, number 3. It becomes a cycle. This is kind of what I suggest for us as a concrete way of not simply giving people information, but leading them to an experience of Christ that helps them understand who they are in the larger body of the church, and why any of this matters to begin with. But there are challenges, unfortunately. right? There are challenges to some of these things. Now, think about those five needs that we had. The first need was to know Christ, but we all struggle with doubt. Doubt is something that we all struggle with. That is just kind of a part of the modern landscape. And that's fine, because we're going to talk about how we can turn those challenges into opportunities. But for every need that we've identified, there's a corresponding challenge, which is why it's hard, which is why we're called to work, which is why being a Christian isn't easy. Being a Christian is about love and sacrifice and dedicating ourselves, right? Faith, we're challenged by doubt. 2, to understand who we are, we're sometimes challenged by self-preoccupation. Instead of knowing who we are in connection with Christ, we're kind of full of ourselves. We're consumed. We think we're, the main characters in this unfolding dramatic story. Our social media presence is whatever it is. Like our universe centers on us, as opposed to the universe centers upon the person of Christ. So we're a little full of ourselves. That prevents us from actually understanding who we are. 3rd, to belong to the full community of the church, loneliness. Loneliness is something that we all struggle with. If anything, loneliness has been harder during the course of the pandemic, but here in the United States anyway, loneliness has been an epidemic for years. And it's something that we haven't really been talking about. It's something that we haven't been noticing, especially amongst young people. We need to belong to the full community of the church, but we feel so isolated. We feel so alone. We have to address that. 4th, we said that it's about being empowered with a faith that makes a difference. Young people in particular don't know where to start. I've had so many conversations with people who don't know how to set up their icons to do a prayer corner. We tell young people to pray, and then if you actually talk to them later on, they say, okay, how? What words do I say? When do I do it? Like, they don't know where to begin. We have to take them by the hand and walk them through this. It's like sometimes being a Christian can feel like walking into the shampoo aisle at the supermarket, and there's 40, 50, 60, 70 choices, and you don't know what to do. You don't know what to do. Somebody needs to point to you and say, that's the one, right? It's hard. And then 5, we need to have a sense of the teachings of the faith, but we have that experience of flatness about the world, that it doesn't really matter. Young people like Catherine, like, why? Why should I learn what the church tells me? Society tells me this. Why should I learn about Christ? I've never experienced him, right? As if a young person is going to sit down to a lecture about, like, here are the 7 ecumenical councils and dates and so forth and so on. Like, if that young person doesn't know who Christ is, what's the point of all those facts and figures? It's all flat. It's all empty. So those are those needs. These are those challenges. And these are challenges that can be daunting, right? Loneliness is a daunting sort of thing. Doubt scares us as Christians. Doubt really scares us as Christians. But the beauty, think about the cross, right? The cross was a method of execution, the most brutal, base method of execution that the Roman Empire had to offer. And yet we wear them around our necks now, because Christ took this instrument of death and he turned it into an instrument of life. These challenges can be baptized by us in ministry, right? Christ doesn't meet us at the top. He meets us at the bottom. Christ doesn't meet us when everything is going well. He meets us when things are tough. And so these are the tough things that we struggle with as modern people. We struggle with doubt. We struggle with being full of ourselves. That's exactly where Christ meets us. These are not challenges that should threaten us. These can actually be reframed as opportunities for reaching people in the midst of all of this. And this is where we talk about, like, the practices, not just like the things that we can convince people of, but the things that we can do with people. So we have the challenge of doubt that can be addressed with practices of faith. What is a practice of faith? Think back to the scripture. Scripture tells us to be still and know that I am the Lord. How many times, for example, in the course of our ministries, do we actually sit in silence with each other? Right? I feel like as an Orthodox Christian, I am more likely to listen to a 45-minute lecture about silence than to actually sit with my eyes closed for 5 minutes, somebody teaching me to calm my heart and to actually be still and open my heart to the presence of Christ. Right? Practices of faith, things that we can do to actually open myself to an experience of Christ. That can be the antidote or pushing back against that doubt. 2, we have our self-preoccupation. We can push back against that with practices of self-emptying. Self-emptying, this is classic Orthodox Christian stuff, right? This is fasting, right? This is philanthropy. This is ways that I give of myself to others. One of our challenges as modern people, though, is to think about the way that applies in our particular modern context. Food, I think in particular, like definitely helps, right? I mean, we now have more food than we know what to do with. We throw away so much food. My grandparents in the mountains of Greece would be scandalized with the amount of food that we throw away on a daily or weekly basis. So fasting is something that is really important, a way to sort of make ourselves feel comfortable being uncomfortable, a way to let go of ourselves and humble ourselves a little bit by giving. But there's other things that we can do in terms of self-emptying. One thing that I think the church hasn't really figured out yet is how to deal with technology, for example. We have a robust sense of what it is to fast from food. We don't really have a sense of what it is to fast from social media, for example. You know, if a young person were in their bed at 3 o'clock in the morning, wide awake, eating chicken wings, you would probably tell them, like, you might have a problem with food. And yet, people of all ages are in their lying in bed, scrolling on their social media, 2 in the morning, 3 in the morning, 4 in the morning, no boundaries at all around this. Every time their phone beeps, they look at it, right? Like if you've got like an iPhone, it tells you how many hours a day you spend on your phone. Lord have mercy. No boundaries. We can begin to help people see, like we can put gates around these. We can put boundaries around these. We can teach people to empty themselves so that there's more space for Christ to act in them. 3, we talked about the challenge of loneliness. This is where fellowship comes in. And real fellowship, right? Here's what I mean by fellowship. A point of contrast. I've had the experience very many times going to church, going to liturgy, afterwards speaking to somebody, hello, how are you? Doing very well. How are you? Doing very well. Nice weather, isn't it? It sure is. See you next Sunday. And those become the limit of my interactions with most of my fellow parishioners. You can have a room packed with people, and yet people still feel lonely in that room because there's actually no connection that's there. By fellowship, I mean vulnerability. By fellowship, I mean honesty. By fellowship, I mean people knowing each other and being known by others. You know, especially with kids, I feel like we can pack a bunch of kids together for a retreat or a basketball tournament or whatever it is. We can have 1,000 kids in the hall, and yet they're all just kind of yelling and screaming at the top of their lungs. Nobody's actually getting to know anybody or being known by anybody. That's not real fellowship in the deep sense of the word. You know, I ride the subway here in New York. I can be literally shoulder to shoulder with people who are strangers. I can feel 4 or 5 strange bodies crammed against me in rush hour. Doesn't make me any less alone. The mere presence of bodies isn't fellowship, right? It's the openness of our hearts that marks real fellowship. 4, that choice paralysis, that where the heck do I begin? We can push back against that with discipleship. Think about mentorship, for example. How many of us feel like we have mentors in the church? How many of us feel like we have somebody older in the faith who knows what he or she is doing, who can actually walk us through it? You know, this is part of our DNA as Orthodox Christians. We talk about having spiritual fathers and spiritual mothers, which is, of course, very, very important. But ideally, there should be multiple such relationships in our lives, right? People who know how to pray, who can tell us how to pray. People who know how to fast, who can teach us how to fast. People who can come up to us and say, you know what, that was a very unkind word that you said back there. You might need to work on your patience or your anger. People who can show us what it is to be a Christian. It's not something that I can teach myself about. That's the hallmark of foolishness and pride. I need to be the disciple of somebody. I need to be the mentee of somebody. I think young people in particular they feel like they're figuring it out by themselves, which is why we go to the internet and why we go to other nonsense places to try to figure it out. Lord have mercy. And then 5, to learn the teachings of the faith, which we don't want to because we have that experience of flatness, we suggest the practices of testimony. What do I mean by that? Making it known the way that God has acted in our lives, making it known that God is actually real and acts in our lives, you know, making it known that I was struggling with this, I prayed to the Lord and he answered me and this happened. I think young people often have this sense of like, what does it matter, right? None of this is real. But if we have a favorite saint, right? If we have an experience of Christ's action in the world, why keep it to ourselves? I think about the ways that I have been nourished by the lives of saints. It's wonderful to me to read the life of a saint, to be reminded that God is actually real and he's acting in this or that person. But why are these only books that we have on our shelves? I'm sure most of us, maybe all of us, have had some sort of experience or know somebody who has had some sort of experience. Sharing those stories gives us comfort. Sharing those stories helps us to know that it matters. And it introduces people to the person of Christ again. And again, we're creating this loop. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. To know Christ, to know who we are in connection with him, to know who we are in the body of the church, to realize this matters. And then we can actually know more nuts and bolts about it. So in summary, right, those 5 needs, we've got this rhythm of need, challenge, opportunity. Young people need to know Jesus, but they struggle with doubt. But it's not just a challenge, because that becomes an opportunity for the practices of faith, for Christ to meet them in their doubt and nourish their faith. Young people need to know who they truly are, but they struggle with self-preoccupation. This is a challenge, yes, but it becomes an opportunity for the practices of self-emptying, to fast, to put our phones away, right? To put limits around ourselves. So we get rid of these distractions and these self-absorbing practices that we get into, so we can make more space for God to be active in our lives. Young people need to belong to the full community of the church, but they struggle with loneliness. This is a challenge, yes, but it becomes an opportunity for the practices of fellowship. Because what a wonderful experience it is when you're feeling that loneliness, to be seen, to have somebody come and minister to you in the midst of that loneliness. Young people need to be empowered with a faith that makes a difference, but they struggle with choice paralysis. Challenge, but it can be baptized into an opportunity for the practices of discipleship, for somebody to take them by the hand and teach them how to be a Christian, how to set up their prayer corner, right? How to say their prayers. Young people need to be equipped with the teachings of the faith, but they struggle with that sense of flatness. What does any of this matter? It's a challenge, yes, but it becomes an opportunity for the practices of testimony, for us to share the ways that God has touched us in our lives, for us to share the stories of our favorite saints, for us to share these, we live in stories, right? For so many young people, the Marvel Cinematic Universe is more real than the kingdom of God, because they tell a compelling story. And we have all of these stories and we keep them secret, or we keep them quiet. Why not share our stories of the way that God has touched us, the way that God has been with us, the way that God has visited us, the way that Christians, who are the hands and feet of God in this world, have visited us? This for me is very personal. I look back on the life of Catherine and I realized that I was kind of on the same path as she was. I was 100% on the same path as she was. My involvement in ministry goes back to the time I was, I don't even remember now, 9 or 10. I was teaching little kids to read when I was in elementary school. My Sunday school finished in 8th grade when I was about 12. So starting in 13, I was an assistant teacher in Sunday school. I was a basketball coach. I was involved in ministry from the time I was very young. And yet, at the same time, especially when I was in high school, I was beginning to develop that sense of emptiness within. I was beginning to lose touch with the church because I had never really experienced Christ. I never really knew why it mattered. And I was too ashamed to say anything because my mother was the Sunday school director. I was an assistant teacher. I couldn't actually go and have a conversation with anybody. Like, I'm not sure if I'm a Christian. I mean, I could have, but I didn't feel like I could. And so I went to college and I gradually drifted away from the church. I didn't make the choice to become an atheist. It's just that God wasn't there. He wasn't somebody that I spoke to. He wasn't somebody that I knew. He wasn't somebody that I thought about. So he wasn't somebody that I spent time with. He's somebody I forgot about. When I was a junior in college, my father passed away. And that was the first time, I think, in my entire life that I actually prayed. And I prayed to a God that I wasn't even sure was there, because I was terrified that if there is no God and my father has passed away, then my father is gone, right? If there's no God, there's no afterlife. All my father is a body that's being eaten by worms in the ground. And it was a hard thought. My dad was my hero. My dad was somebody that I if I can ever turn out to be half the man he is, I'll be doing okay. So I called out to this God that I wasn't sure was there for weeks, probably the most earnest prayer that I've ever done. And after weeks of this, I had this distinct impression that a hand came across me. Not a real hand, right? But it felt like it. I'm not even sure how to describe it. A hand came across me to comfort me, and a voice came to me. A wordless voice came to me and said, "Don't worry. He's with me. He's okay." And that changed everything. That is still something that I'm trying to figure out and understand in my life, because I called out to the void. I called out into the vast nothingness of the cosmos, and somebody was there. Somebody heard me, and somebody responded. Right? I had an experience of Christ in that moment. And that was so much more valuable than all of the lessons and all of the empty words that I had spent my life hearing. It suddenly mattered. For the first time in my life, it mattered because I knew he was there. And that began to change the way that I saw myself. I, at that point, wanted to go into politics and become president of the United States and save the world and all sorts of other harebrained nonsense. And my sense of myself changed from that moment. I began rethinking of what it is to be called to ministry, and a bunch of steps ended up taking me to the church and so forth, right? I mean, I can talk to you about the way that I began to feel connected with people in the church, my experience at seminary, my experiences at summer camp, my experiences actually getting to know faithful, committed Christians, to feel like I am part of their community, a real community of people, to know that it matters, to see people who've sacrificed their lives for the sake of the Lord. Maybe not literally in the sense of martyrdom, but who've given away fortunes for the sake of their love of the Lord. All of it starts with that experience, right? That one experience, for me, is the cornerstone of my entire life. For me, is the keystone in the arch. Without it, the rest of it falls apart. That's the sort of stuff that we need to share, right? That fifth experience, that testimony, that practice, to help people realize that this matters, that these aren't just dead words on the pages of dusty books, but God is still active in our lives here in 2021. He's active here in the United States. He's active in Australia. He's active everywhere. And people need to know that, because it's reassuring to them. It helps them understand that this matters. It helps them understand that this is real. It helps them change their lives and not just think about God, but take steps to know him. Take steps to actually be Christians. Transforms people who go up this mountain of ministry and come back faithful Christians rather than former Christians. I've said a lot, and I've tried to summarize things as much as possible. If you're interested in learning more, I do want to give you guys an opportunity here. I wouldn't say we wrote the book on ministry, because it's more of an online course, but we have this online course called Effective Christian Ministry, which gets into a lot of this in more detail. If you're a parent, if you're somebody who works in ministry, is involved in ministry, if you just want a sense of personal enrichment and want to understand yourself a little bit more and the contemporary culture a little bit more, we've created a discount code for all our friends here at Orthodox Cafe. You can go to the website effectivechristianministry.org, and you can register for half off. The registration is normally $75 US. You can register for $37.50. The coupon expires on October 22nd. So if you're interested, it's not a book. Like I said, it's an online course, 13 videos to take you through the stuff that we've talked about here in greater depth and help you think about what that means for your life. What do the practices of faith look like for your life and your community? What do the practices of self-emptying look like for you and your community? If anything has been of interest, I invite you to keep looking into it. But like I said, I've said a lot. I've crammed a lot into your brains, for which I apologize. But maybe we can chat about it a little bit now.